Hello, and welcome to Navigating Patterns. So, what I have for you today is a bit of an unexpected treat. I recently had a conversation with a man named Philippe Lewis, and I'll give you a little bit of his background in a bit, but I just want to tell you how this came about. I have a friend, Kira, who facilitated this conversation between Philippe and I, and we really got into ethics and morality, which is kind of a fun topic, among other things. This conversation was unscripted, very last minute. We had delayed it from a previous time that was scheduled, and it was just wonderful the way it unfolded. And Philippe agreed to share it, and Kira was with us, so that was nice just to have that extra perspective on these topics. And Philippe Lewis is a relationship educator and the creator of Exquisite Dark Love, which supports men and women in making better choices for being sovereign individuals in their relationships. He's also the founder of several Facebook groups, including the Attachment Community. This Facebook group happens to be the one where Kira ran into Philippe and where she sort of thought that I could offer the most help and in discussion. And it was lovely because Philippe and Kira were very patient with me during the discussion as I sort of helped them understand, my conception of ethics and morality. And hopefully I've given them better tools to talk about such things. And hopefully those tools will be available to you as well. As always, my definitions: you like them, keep them. You don't like them, throw them out, or better yet, modify them for your own use. I really hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did. Thank you.
That my level of my level of understanding of ethics at the philosophical level is very much not related to anything academic or and not much reading of books. So it's just my own version. So I'll just preface that.
Okay. Should be fine.
Yeah, that's what I figured. But it's it's like sometimes I encounter people who've done a lot of actual research and a lot of reading. I'm feeling a little sort of underdressed.
Yeah, I'm not an academic. I haven't done that much reading, but
okay, cool.
Plenty of research and hashing things out. So.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, a lot of the ways that I engage in my own research, if there's such a thing that I'm doing, is by thinking about things, putting the words out on Facebook, because that sort of became my microblogging platform. And then people start to engage in conversations, and then I'm like, oh, that's an interesting point. That's another interesting point. And some people post to get thumbs up or likes or agreement. I'm mostly posting because it's an active conversation in my head, and I tend to approach my inquiries, because that's really what they are, not from a perspective of what's happening, what do I think is happening, rather than a moral approach, which is what's right and what's wrong. Because I think, even though I'm not too much of a more relativist, I do believe that everybody's got their own version of a moral framework that they engage with. And to understand why there's conflict, I think it's important to know that.
Yeah, I think actually our primary problem is people don't have a moral framework at all. They just think they do. And then when they run into conflict, everything blows up because they can't square the circle. And that's when you transgress. Right. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, good. So we have a lot of people that come into the Discord server, and from the way I see it, they're unethical. They can't resolve ethical questions because they don't have a sense of ethics even a little bit.
So they do have some kind of framework, but it's a shitty framework that doesn't work.
They don't have a framework. Actually, most of their arguments, most of their arguments boil down to, if someone did it in the moment, it must have been right. And I'm like, okay, so you've never acted unethically in the past yourself. And they're like, well, no, that's not possible. And I'm like, well, it's not possible for you to act unethically. So do you have a sense of ethics, right? No, the answer is no. And they're never in a position to judge anybody else. right? Unless they nail things down with like, well, the Sam Harris trick where you go, well, if this and 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 this, then on ethics, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe, but right, but you can't really do that in real life.
Would you be willing to just define ethics really quickly the way you see it, we're on the same definition?
Yeah, I use a two-tier system where ethics is the ideal and morality is implementation. And so the reason why I do that is so that if you implement something incorrectly through a mistake, but you actually intended the ideal, then I can forgive you and move on.
But that still doesn't define your that still doesn't.
Well, the ethics are the ideal, and they're a landscape. They move around, right? And so that.
Well, what do you mean by ideal?
So in an ideal situation, everybody gets what they want from that situation, right?
I see. Okay.
Right. And so the ethical behavior is the one that gives the maximal stuff to the maximal number of people, right? And then there's still a tension there, right? Because people aren't equal, right? And that's where the landscape comes in. People aren't equal, situations aren't equal, the same situation across time's not equal, right? So it's everything about it is moving on all three planes.
So even ideal is difficult to nail, especially in situations where, like what you have to define some kind of like the most people or the most effective. Like for me, I use it, maybe it's similar enough. I use like what's the most effective thing that you can do in that particular moment and situation, given all the variables. But even that's kind of a matter of mastery of understanding of what's at play.
That's why people are unethical, because they don't have an understanding at all of ethics, right? And if you don't have an understanding of what ethics might be, right, and you can't resolve ethical questions, then without the understanding, it doesn't even matter if you had, quote, an ethical structure or ethical framework, because you don't have the way to measure within it. And then ethics as an ideal, the ideal I like to use is cause the least harm. And the reason why is because you're in trade-off mode all the time. And so it's never like do the best good for everybody. It's always, well, cause the least amount of harm in the situation. And then you can have arguments about, well, is the least amount of harm harming nature the least or harming people the least, right? There's all those considerations.
Or not feeling good enough or, feeling triggered, like especially in the social justice movement nowadays, a lot of it, I think initially it was about doing the reducing harm happening to groups of people, but these days it seems to have devolved into everybody's feeling good.
Well, they had no ethical system at all, or framework, or sense of ethics, and that's what happened. Is it becomes parasitic on lived experience? Okay, but that's just phenomenology.
Well, and this gets into an interesting point, which is what they value more than what it seems like people in that group value more than anything else is safety/security. And and if you're valuing security or safety above everything else, then how do you how do you navigate that? Because if that's what you value above everything else, then if you're uncomfortable in any way, then then there's something wrong. And and this is something that where it sort of bridges into the conversation about attachment, which is because Mark and I have had conversations about attachment theory and the difficulty of valuing security. If we think of attachment theory as valuing as putting security, and we would have to get into the definition of that and everything else, then you end up with a situation where maybe there's a different way of framing some or languaging some of the stuff that we talk about in the attachment community in a different way.
Right. Yeah. So I want to go back to the piece around sort of harming the least people. So that puts a focus on harm, right, as a value. And if you put and the way I define a moral framework is that it's a list of values in order of priority. And I refer to Lakoff. He produced a really nice paper like 20 years ago that sort of defines the two primary moral frameworks that are active in the U.S., which is one is the strict father moral framework, which then gives you sort of the right on a political level, and then there's the nurturant parent on the left, and what he shows is that they're the same values but in a different order of priority, and that gives you essentially how to act most effectively in any situation. Now, he also ends up showing in that same paper that, or actually in a book that he wrote called Moral Politics, where he ends up showing that research shows that the strict father-parent model is not as effective for people developmentally in terms of how they end up being effective sort of humans later on. The nurturant parent does a much better job, like, you know, whipping your son into submission doesn't work as well as we thought. Yeah, big surprise. But having said that, there needs to be values. And so even in ethics, I would imagine that there needs to be, you need to say, this is the most important value that we're going to try to maximize, and this one second, this one third, this one fourth.
Right. Well, that's the problem with those things, right?
Right.
You can't keep them static, right? If they're static, they're not going to work. And then, you know, I would say that B.F. Skinner is the king of nurturing.
Skinner's?
Right? Yeah, B.F. Skinner's I mean, he did a lot of good things in psychology, but he did a lot of bad things in psychology, right? And one of the things he did was he had a theory that if you don't punish your children and you only use reward, then everybody will be a good person. And of course, he did that experiment and it failed, right? And other people did, like his son did it after him, and it also failed, right? And so the other end of the coin doesn't work either. And it's
I have a son, and we're having that exact problem. Just the reward system. He needs to feel some level of pain in some cases. Otherwise, it's just like we have to keep giving him more.
Right. Well, and the bottom line is, according to evolution, that makes sense. Like pain should be more important to you than reward. Like it just should. Right. The negative things are the things that kill you. So those are the things you have to pay the most attention to.
It's adaptive that way. Yeah, it's you know, definitely from evolutionary biology standpoint, it's more adaptive to stay away from the things that are painful and to move towards the things that are rewarding. But yes, if you only use reward.
In evolutionary biology, the second part's not true. It's just the whole game in evolution is keep away from things that kill you. Yeah, it doesn't say anything about the things that make you better. It only says things about, well, because everything's going to get wiped out every once in a while by a gamma ray burst or a volcano, whatever it is. Right? So seeking pleasure doesn't give you advantages in those situations, but survival does.
Right.
Survival is the only thing. It's not being pitted against anything. It's not a dichotomy. Survival, that's it. Right. Because it's survival plus randomness equals evolution or something. Right. That's roughly.
It's just basically not dying is enough to kind of keep you around and evolving because you're around. Right.
Yeah, the randomness.
And then maybe over. Yeah.
Randomness can't work if you're dead.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe over time you kind of like the survival rate of some smarter sort of substrains or not strains, but subgroups actually ends up being higher, and then they stick around longer or more effectively than others. So in a way,
right?
Oh well, yeah, exactly. But
because the lizards had us for a long time, and then they all got wiped out by whatever they got wiped out by: snowball Earth, meteorite, volcanoes. Probably.
I mean, in a way, I mean, it's that, and that's usually the way I teach it. And hopefully, I'm not wrong with this. So I'm gonna put it on the table in front of you. Is that the lower layers of our brain are still in charge of the higher layers. It just allows us to do things in a more sophisticated way. Yep. But it's still about, bottom line, it's about the lower layer of the brain, which is about survival. And then how we survive is, the additional layers.
Yep. That's almost certainly true. Yeah.
But that's not about reward at all. It's just about basically effectiveness or maybe ethics, if that makes sense, at the primal level.
Right. So Jordan Peterson talks about ethics in terms of what happens with rats if you don't let a smaller rat win 30% of the time, they won't play anymore. Why? Because they're not growing, learning, and getting anything out of it. And so
that's right.
the change rate is zero for not for the evolution, because evolution is generational, but for the adaptation. Right. It's the local adaptation that matters. And that's the part that people confuse with evolution all the time. They say, oh, local adaptation, and therefore it's like, no, local adaptation has nothing to do with evolution, totally different time scales. It's more about the variability within the range of the individual that has been born, right? Not on the time scale of generations, right?
Yeah. Well, it's cool because as humans, because we're able to build sort of build knowledge into things like books and media and also build things that will stand multiple generations. We're actually able to, the adaptation gets to pile up on top of what was built. It's not, you know, we're evolving faster as a result. I mean, and not biologically, but by piling up on top of the knowledge we already have. Now, whether or not that means we're going to survive this iteration is anybody's guess.
Yeah,
I mean, I think evolve our way out of existence. That's what I think.
That's the Dawkins thesis, right? Is that right? But I don't know that Dawkins right. I mean, Brett Weinstein actually called Dawkins out for it. Of course, now Brett Weinstein's making the same error, actually saying we have more control of this evolution than we do. But I mean, that goes right back to ethics. So what has been adopted for humans has been cooperation per se, and so. The highest ethic from an evolutionary standpoint, and I'm not making this case, but I'm saying you could make this case, is cooperation, right?
Right.
So it is this idea of being together with other humans. And so that would say that what you don't want to do is be on your own, right? You want to be in a relationship, and you want that relationship to be couched in a community, and you want that community to be couched in a larger group, et cetera, right? So you want these group structures because that's what we've evolved and adapted to over the span of evolution so far.
Yeah, but tribalism can still operate under that assessment.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I'm not speaking towards tribalism. I mean, I don't particularly like that term, although I think I'm coming to terms with where it came from. I think the problem with tribalism is that it's an asymmetrical relationship, and it's a negative relationship with everybody who isn't in your tribe. Right. And so it's very black and white, but the world doesn't work that way. Fortunately, I have a series of videos. I have a YouTube channel called Navigating Patterns.
Okay.
And in there, I have a series of videos. I'm actually working on the last one now. I just did the slides last night, where I'm making this case for why you can't do that binary, sort of adjustment, at that scale where you're talking about us versus them and how to get out of it. Like you just need a perspectival shift, and all of a sudden that problem goes away instantly. And that's the beautiful part.
I think what was that? The Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. What's his name? The guy who did that that you sent me, Kira.
John Vervaeke.
Yeah, Vervaeke would probably call it out like scaling out. Like, okay, now you have a little bit more perspective that actually, if all these groups are able to work together, it's actually gonna take us even further, evolutionary, or just keep us alive longer instead of destroying each other.
Keep us alive longer, right? And I think that's why you have these groups that have formed around, say, marriage, right? Around government, right? At local level, government at abroad, right? Because having those larger groups with similarities and not too many differences in them actually makes a difference in terms of the survivability of those patterns, we'll say, over time.
Keegan has these different levels of neurological development. I think he calls it, and there's always this sort of like you're inside the thing, and then you kind of shift your perspective to, okay, you have these things that are happening, and now you can see the larger. It's another form of scaling out, obviously, and it supports having. Also being more flexible around diversity, the diversity of perspective, the diversity of approaches, diversity of moral frameworks, which I see is inevitable. Even if those moral frameworks are non-existent, people still operate as if they have a moral framework, as shitty as it might turn out.
But that's a mapping error, right? So you're assuming they have it because you can map it. But that doesn't mean they actually have it, right? Because again,
they have something. They have some belief system that are based in some values, right? It's not random. It's not complete noise. Like
no,
they operate.
Actually, it often is random. Like when you actually talk to people, oh yeah, you'll find out it's random pretty quickly. Yeah, I do this all day long. Right? You talk to people and you say, all right, well, how come when this person says this thing and they're talking about the same thing as this person that you're interpreting it differently? And then it just turns out that because they're random, like they don't have it, they don't have an ethic, they don't have a moral framework.
Is it random, or is it that they don't have the language to describe it?
No, it's random. It's the same condition and a different answer. And so that's effectively random from any point of view, because you're not hanging it on anything.
But if you were to spend enough time talking to someone and getting to the point of saying, like we've been doing, of like, what is the trade-off of like, well, in this case, I'm prioritizing this because this connection, connection with this person.
I do that. They can't explain it because they don't have it. They literally don't have it. They don't have it.
Okay. So what you're saying is that there's a lack of moral solidity or some version of that.
You don't. Yeah. If you assume you need morals and ethics to make decisions, then you'll come to the conclusion that everybody's acting morally or ethically. Right. Fair enough.
Or they try.
Yep. Fair enough. But if you assume that they don't need that to act, because you can just act without even thinking about it, which is concurrent with what you said earlier, right? The lizard brain just does stuff, right? And so if you're not a stoic and you're just reacting to your feelings in the moment, you can't act ethically. It's not possible. You're never rising to the level of cognition of ethics. Even you're not even close.
What could you then say? Would it be fair to say that they're acting out of a more primal version of ethics? Like at a lower level.
No, I don't think that exists. I think and I don't think anybody would argue with that. I think that people believe that ethics, roughly speaking, is the thing that one of the features that differentiates us from lower creatures, which is not to say lower creatures don't have an ethic. Vervaeke actually goes into this in Awakening, right? He talks about it in terms of consciousness, and you could extend that same argument to ethics. I don't know if he makes that argument or not, but basically, I think he does, though, right? Basically, the fact of reciprocity in chimps shows that there's some kind of ethos there, right? And then we get into
like the rats,
ethics.
Even if it's at the primal level, there's kind of a, the rats that do work, that do learn to play together, do better. And so as a result, by the very force of how it happens, they end up, it ends up being better than if they don't play.
Right. There's definitely a Piagetian aspect of the development of ethics. There's plenty of evidence for a physical manifestation of lower level ethics, we'll call it.
Lower level. Okay, I can work with that.
So lower level ethics versus what Philippe was saying, which was more primal ethics.
That would be primal.
Okay,
the lower level.
I would agree with that.
So if people are coming in and they are and they can't articulate it, they might be acting from a lower level of physical ethics versus.
No, they don't have it. Yeah, they're just reacting at that point. That's the thing.
Yeah, they're just in survival mode.
But it's not consistent. Like it's not predictable.
Right.
And therefore it's A, not a framework, B, not a process, and C, not something you can use. Like it's just not useful because it's not reliable.
So how do you determine who's got it and who doesn't got it?
Well, I mean, it really is the reliability and consistency that matters.
Okay, so you're looking for a reliable behavior.
Right. If
that's not just survival.
Right. You can make a simple argument. If the thing's not reliable, you can't care about it because there's no point interacting with something that's unreliable. Like there's no point in behaving as if something unreliable is real because that's part of our definition of real.
So would you say that reliability is a high value in your ethical framework? Reliability is high on that list?
No. Well, you're mixing the result with the statement, right? The statement of reliability. So for example, if an evolutionary biologist makes an argument for evolution, it's based on reliability. That's survival of the fittest. And it's literally reliably the case that the fittest survive, right? It's a reliability argument. And then you can make that same argument for ethics. Now, if you're saying there's a value called reliability, there is, right? And then how that fits in the ethical framework, that's a different question, but you can't confuse those two things.
Well, so I have
more along the lines of integrity.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, you know, if I interact with a dog and the dog is, or my cat for that matter, my cat's pretty reliable, right? I know when she's going to show up to ask for food. I know how she asks for food. You know, if I fuck with her while she's asking for food, I know there's a point where it's going to be too much. It's just going to bat my hand.
You don't know what that point is.
Oh, I do.
You do.
I get better. I get better at determining what that point is, and
yeah.
Well, no, I mean,
and it changes. It changes with the cat's mood too, right? As expected.
Right. But I do learn about her, and her responses are not completely random. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Well, the cats have an ethos. Yeah, and that's why why they're pets, and that's why we interact with them.
Yeah. If they were completely random, well, no. I mean, even snakes, I don't have an ethos, but they do engage in a particular way. And if you stick your hand in the cage while there's a live rat in there, they'll bite you. But otherwise, they don't. It's not completely random.
Maybe not. I mean, India, the people in India might disagree, right? The snake charmers can do things.
Depends on the snake.
That's the thing, right? That's the thing. I mean, that's an ethos, right? And it's manipulatable, right? But the animals can't break that, right? So that's your lower level biological reliable ethics right there.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. That's what I'm talking about. So
as opposed to what humans have. Right, which is they know they're doing wrong and they do it anyway, right?
That's so humans are able to, so humans are able to overcome or override their primal ethos, if you want to call it that way,
or they have more than primal ethos as a result of the level of consciousness they have, and that would be my argument.
Right,
is that consciousness and ethics go hand in hand, and you need more consciousness for more ethics, basically.
Right. Yeah, and having said that, I mean, when I look at society with laws and sort of rules of engagement, whether they're social, they're not embedded into law, but there's the law seems to have been created to sort of kind of nudge people towards a sort of a safer way of co-living culturally.
I think that's backwards, actually. So again,
really?
I have a video of this on my channel. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Wow.
I got a bunch of little videos on. Yeah, most of them are short.
Cool.
So, yeah, I think the way it works is we do these things and then we codify them, right? And the reason why we codify them is as pointers to strangers, children, other people, and reminders to ourselves, right?
Right.
And so there's no point at which something like the law of man, we'll call it, because we need to differentiate it from the law of nature, which a lot of philosophers don't know how to do, and say the law of man is never something that's coming down on top of us. That just never happens, which isn't
coming down. What do you mean?
Right. It's not constraining us. It's pointing the way. But it's providing an ideal, right?
Right.
It doesn't prevent us from doing things. Like we were just driving, right? And there's these little signs by the road that have little numbers on them. Yeah, I don't pay any attention to those.
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean.
But that's human law. I just ignore it because whatever. Yeah. And if there are consequences, there are consequences. Those are two different questions, right? Yeah. And that's where people get confused. So like I had a guy a few weeks ago, a very nice guy on the Discord channel, and he's like, Jeff Bezos has his hands in everything and he's controlling me. And I eventually just said, yeah, just don't buy from Amazon, kid, and you're all done.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But you know, if you pretend like these quote powers and principalities, this term Paul Vanderklay uses a lot.
Yeah.
And you pretend these powers and principalities are actually controlling you, then you're gonna be a victim, but they're not actually controlling you. Like, just don't buy from Amazon, and Jeff Bezos's control over your world is basically zero. I mean, I ended up proving it to him by grabbing my Alexa, which hasn't been turned on in 3 years, and literally threw it in the living room. I just shut it behind me on camera. I was like, there you go, Jeff Bezos. Who owns who now? Right? And of course, it's
well, So laws are useful to more as a guideline, right? They're not controlling. Laws of nature control you, I guess, in the sense that if you throw yourself off a building, chances are you're going to fall to your death. You know, law of nature.
They're not just guidelines, but they're pointing at the ideal. They're giving you a way
Which
to
is
orient. Right. They're giving you a way to orient. They're giving you a way to understand the cost, because that's a big deal. I don't know if you read the book Freakonomics.
No, not yet.
Oh, great book. Great book. The original book is classic. So one of the things they point out, they've got this wonderful example where they had a daycare center, right, where you drop off your kids and then you come and pick them up. And parents were picking up their kids like 15 minutes late. And they're like, this is ridiculous. We've got to do something about this. So what they did was they said, if you pick up your kids 15 minutes late, you have to pay an additional $50. So do you know what happened as a result of that?
Oh, yeah.
More people picked up their kids late because now they had a boundary. So they're like, oh, I'm happy to pay $50 extra if I can be 15 minutes late.
Oh, well, and it depends on what the punishment is, right? If the punishment is high enough, then you'll see that curve go down.
But actually, that's not the way it works, because people are just willing to pay anything to be late. Like that's what actually reliably. I mean, yeah, after a certain point maybe, but then people cry, oh, that's outrageous, $1,000, pick the kids up late, and then they just pay, right? And so there is this interaction where like those tricks stop working at a certain level, right? They only work within a tiny frame. And then it's actually better to get them with shame on picking them up late than it is for giving them a trade for picking them up late. That you can
shame is about. In affect theory, shame is one of the affects. It's one of the it's one of the affects, you know, that basically it's one of the only social ones. The rest of the ones are all you know, they're all related to your senses, like disgust, the smell, so you don't die when you eat the wrong food. But you know, this one is a social one. So shame has been used since the dawn of ages to
and
control people.
You don't get rid of it because it's that's part of the physical lower layer ethics, right? That we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
That's definitely part of that. Right. And I think you're right about that, although I'd have to think about it a lot more. Shame is probably the only one that's based on that evolutionary leap towards the cooperation that we desperately require. And that's what binds us in these relationships. Like that's where the relationships come in, is that you need those relationships. And then you could very easily jump, and I'm not necessarily saying this is true, right? But you could easily jump to the conclusion, which may be correct, that you need shame in a relationship to have a healthy relationship. Otherwise you don't have boundaries. And if you don't have boundaries, you can't be in a relationship because there's nothing there.
Yeah, there's got to be something that you feel at a primal level that's threatening to your life in order to be like, okay, you know, I'm going to stay away from that. Like the rumble strips are, you know, on the side of the road, and right after the rumble strips, there's like a massive ditch, which is very common in Costa Rica, by the way. So, you know, you never want to get off the road because usually there's because it rains a lot. So, but so if the laws point at an ideal, then the laws codify at some level a sort of general moral framework of or frame of ethics.
Well, I don't think they rise to that at all, right? I think.
Well, you're talking about the ideal, right? Isn't that ethics points at an ideal?
I think ethics points at an ideal, but I think laws point at conventions. And what they do is they codify the conventions within the space. And the problem with ethics is that ethics, roughly speaking, the only way to talk about ethics, and there's arguments about this, but I think they're all stupid, is virtues. Right? You have to discuss virtues to even talk about the ethical landscape and what that looks like. And then you can get to values and how those values are in relation to one another. And then the implementation, that's where you get into the moral ideal.
Okay. So what would the conventions point towards? Like conventions for what? What's the point of convention?
Well, the convention is behavior within whatever group you're talking about. So federal laws in the US, right, point to when you're behaving as a citizen, what are your, duties and obligations, roughly speaking, right? And what are the punishments if you go outside of them? That's what laws point to, right? And then at the state level, we have the same thing. And then at the local level, we have the same thing. And then we have, and then there's duties and conventions that aren't codified, that are actually stronger than the legal ones, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So
right.
That's the whole thing, is that's where things get messy because
social conventions.
And then this is where the problem is. So I was in a discussion with somebody on a Clubhouse probably a month or two ago, and he likes Immanuel Kant, who I think is ridiculous, but not that everything he says is wrong, but like basically people don't understand him. So I think people like really misstate his stuff. So his whole thing was, you need a way to step outside of the system you're in. And then he thought a system was something like an army. So if you were in Napoleon's army and Napoleon gave you a bad order, you need a way to step outside of that in order to judge it, right? And then, and I think this is ridiculous, by the way, right? Because what he was doing was he was putting laws. He was confusing natural law with the law of man, and then putting that at the top and saying, well, you have to be able to step out of it, and therefore, and then that's what gives you the ability to say no to the order that the general gave. And I would say, no, it's all bottom up. Like we have to have a personal sense of ethics, right, of the ethical landscape, and additionally, the morality, which is the implementation. Well, I disagree with this, but how am I going to implement my disagreement? Right. So one way to implement a disagreement might be, well, I'm going to go to the military. So in the U.S., you can be a conscientious, exemptor, right, and then not serve, right. So you can do that is a thing. It's very hard to do, but you can do it. You can say, no, my religious status, which is interesting. It's a religious argument. Means because I can't kill anybody, I can't serve in the military. And they
What's interesting, right? So you're stating you're kind of on moral grounds that you cannot kill people, and that goes up. If you do it right, I imagine it's probably a process. If you do it right, then it stands above the law of
That's
men.
Right. That's right.
And I want to bring in something interesting here, which is one of the things that they're starting to identify with PTSD is something called moral wounding, which is that you can experience trauma from having violated your own morals.
Right. That's what Peterson talks about, or having violated morals that you didn't understand you had or something, right? Like if you don't have that ethical framework and then you see somebody or you do something that is beyond something you knew about or were capable of, then that's roughly what causes PTSD, as near as anybody can tell, right?
I still think at some level people have even immature versions of a moral framework that maybe is more random that when it's more mature. But I do think I don't think they go from completely random to not random at all. I think there's a trajectory to it. And it starts with the sort of primal ethics, or whatever we want to call it at the moment, and it kind of evolves from there through the different stages of development.
Well, there's certainly an evolution and development. I think one of the deep problems that everybody makes. I know one of the only philosophers I've actually read any of is Ayn Rand, and one of the deep criticisms of Ayn Rand, which is a very famous criticism, is that it doesn't work for kids, right? And then I kind of say, name me a philosophy that accounts for children. Go ahead. I'll give you all the time in the world, because there isn't one. That no philosophy accounts for children. That's not the.
Give me an example. Sorry, I'm not following.
Well, so Ayn Rand is all about, individualism, and objectivism per se is all about like just the ability to be on your own. Whether you're on your own or not, it's not relevant, right? But the ability to stand on your own 2 feet, not rely on other people. It's a very non-cooperative ethic in some sense. In another sense, it's actually way more cooperative, right? Because she talks about selfishness as a virtue, which I think is correct. It's certainly correct evolutionarily. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have a core component of selfishness first.
Right.
And the ethics give us the ability to override it, interestingly, maybe over other animals, because self-sacrifice in other animals is rare. I don't think it's zero, but it's really rare. And in humans, it's actually not rare at all, right? There's martyrdom that goes on at various levels, but even at the level of physical harm, and including death.
Well, self-sacrifice for a greater ideal, or for the group, or for
just one other person.
Yeah. Well, so it's for the sake of
exactly
else, right?
Exactly.
And that's a social evolution, right? Unless there's a sense that there's others to actually group with work for.
That's back to that cooperation and shame idea.
It's a form of cooperation through shame. Wow, that's interesting.
Right. Well, it's true. I mean, that's what gives us the willingness to cooperate is shame, right? Otherwise, where's the driver? Right? There's no driver without that. So in Ayn Rand's world, if you misinterpret her, and most people do, right, you'll understand selfishness the wrong way, and you'll think, no, that means that kids can't, because they've never survived on their own, right? They have granted, right? Like Rousseau proved that. Right. So whatever, right? Like it's a dumb argument because all philosophy suffer from that same thing. Philosophy is not designed, never was designed or intended to solve problems through all phases and stages of physical and mental development across the entire human race. That's not the experiment of philosophy at all. And so it's a bogus way to talk about it. But it's interesting that we have, so even the fact that we raise our young at all, like, is kind of part of whatever that ethic, that larger ethic is. Like wanting better for your children than yourself is certainly a human ethic that animals can't, there's no way animals have a way to do that, right? They can't possibly have a conception of that because
they don't have the capacity for abstraction. So mostly anyway.
Right. Yeah. If you live on the savannah as an elephant, your baby elephant isn't going to get a significantly better life through your means. Like, like that can't happen. It's not an option. So
you can't, they can't imagine something that doesn't exist, or at least not very much. I mean, it could be argued that dolphins and chimps can at some level.
Yeah. You can
imagine the future.
Again, well, but there has to your point, right? There has to be a development cycle. And part of the development cycle of moral and ethics has to start when you're children and go up. Sure, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that you actually develop what we would call, say, non-low level ethics, right? I don't think that there's many ways it could happen that you could just be told a bunch of things, for example, and given a bunch of propositions to live by. But the problem with propositions is that they're too totalizing and they don't allow any interaction with potential. And so when you have a bunch of propositions that bump up against each other, and they will, and you don't have a resolution for them, you can get random behavior. Whereas if you do have a resolution for them, now all of a sudden you have something that's reliable. Like, if somebody offers me $5 on the street and I don't know them, do I accept it? Like, that's an ethical question. There's a real ethical question there. Whereas if somebody offers me $1,000, but they're a friend of mine and I did them a favor, right? Now I feel this reciprocity idea, right? I don't want to feel shame for turning them down when they're trying to become more equal with me by giving me money in exchange for just being a friend or something specific that I did or whatever it is.
That's interesting that you speak of that, because the Lakoff, I'll send you that article. It's a great, super dry, but very, very good. I refer to it all the time. He speaks of the moral books. And the moral books is like, I owe you some version of like, I owe you when you did something for me, or you did something wrong to me. Now you owe me. To balance the moral books. And so it's very much an accountable sort of an accounting system of favors, but it also works with virtue. Like if you're virtuous, you can actually refill your sort of
the reciprocity. It's all it all falls under
or with God.
And then what I do with that is I say, look, this is why people misunderstand competition. The opposite of competition is not cooperation. In order to cooperate, you need competition, because competition contains the scoring system that gives you that accounting for the books.
Right.
And then so cooperation is, quote, higher than competition, but relies entirely on competition. You cannot, the two are not in opposition. They work together to allow each other to function, to allow for cooperation at a higher level, to allow for community. Cool. Right? That's like reciprocity doesn't work without scoring. And the minute you score, you're in competition mode. And cooperation is the result of competition. And then they're not in opposition anymore, because they never were really. It's just a confusion that people have.
Right. Well, and you can bring it all the way back to the two rats, playing together. And what causes them to want to play more or want to play less? I mean, there's this sense of
the competition.
Of a competition, but it's also like the possibility of learning and rising up. Like, I want to try again. I want to try again. I want to try again, because it's part of the game.
And
sometimes
if he's not learning,
sometimes you lose.
Yeah, if the little rat's not learning, anything because he's just getting trounced right away, then there's no point. Right. There's no competition. Yeah. Right. It's not a competition anymore. That's how we talk about it. Right. Yeah. And so you need the cooperation to have the competition to learn the thing. Like they're just intertwined together. And then that, again, that goes back to cooperation. And then if everything is a competition between you and nature, you and other people, then you're never safe. Like you can't ever be safe. And being safe means that you're going to get weakened because you're not in competition that makes you stronger. Like that's what competition does, gives you signaling to tell you how to get stronger. And so that's where my argument against safety comes in. If you have safety as the highest virtue, then you have a problem because you're going to weaken yourself. And if you, safety is not a one axis thing. You can feel safe emotionally, you can feel safe physically, you can feel safe, you can feel safe in the moment, right? Whereas you feel safe along a longer term, right? There's that whole time component. So there's lots of aspects to safety. Yeah. And if you hold those aspects highest above everything else, then what happens is whatever flaws you have that you were bumping up in the place where you had a problem, those never get addressed. And that's an issue.
Right, because you never have you're never really competing against anything in order to overcome in order to overcome the weaknesses.
All the signaling is gone with no feedback. Right. Feedback is signaling. Right. All the signaling is gone. And so if you're in a relationship and somebody's doing something and you don't like it and you want to flee to safety, you leave the relationship. Well, you've solved that problem and caused about 100 worse problems in some sense. Right. First of all, you still have that problem. And maybe it wasn't a problem, but maybe it was. Like you don't know anymore, right? And so you get in the next relationship, you have the same problem, only now it's worse because you feel justified. So right now you flee to safety, you're just never going to be in a relationship at that rate. And I've seen that happen before for sure.
There's a teacher of mine would say safety is a feeling and security is an illusion. And his sense was, safety is just how you feel. I mean, and it is not directly connected to it's not an objective perspective. It's always relative.
Right.
And so
you can't have total safety, right? You can't have zero harm because then you're losing all the signaling, and you need that signaling to learn and grow and change and become and you need that signaling to know you're alive effectively. And that's when people get emotionally deadened. That's what happens. They're not seeing emotional signals, so they can't respond emotionally to things.
Right. So maybe that's the point where they start to seek challenges because they want to push against something. They want something to push against, or a relationship that will shake them up.
Right. Or something physical, like Trent Reznor, right? Like, I hurt myself today, right? Like, oh, why did you hurt yourself? Because I'm emotionally dead. Yes, that's exactly what, there are whole songs about this, right? So that happens all the time.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's also the version of, I always get hurt, and that feels like the normal for me. I mean, I've certainly people who've gone through a lot of trauma, and their normal is to get hurt. And if they don't get hurt, it actually feels abnormal. So they sabotage the relationship, or they just create conflict where there wasn't any, because because they grew up in an environment that was, I would call it overly competitive. In terms of emotionally competitive, like who's winning emotionally, and emotional bodies constantly like at war with each other, and they interpret they basically there wasn't enough collaboration for them to really learn from it. There was always competition, and there was never a point of finding out like how do we work together. So there was no learning around collaboration.
Yeah, that can certainly happen. I've seen that. Yeah.
That'd be my perspective on it. At least having been with partners and lovers who are very, very chaotic and very emotionally, who've grown up with a lot of from an attachment perspective, like the people are disorganized or fearful avoidance. They grow up trying to love somebody who's hurting them all the time, and so they kind of connect. Their version of collaboration is fighting.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's their norm. Yeah, you kind of expect people to go towards their norms. So yeah, I mean, I don't think the attachment stuff, and I haven't looked super deeply into it, but Kira's got me on the group, and I've seen a lot of the posts and stuff. I don't think that particular map is wrong or in any way or anything like that. But again, if the concern that I have is if you're seeking safety, you're not necessarily right. If because safety can feel like leaving the relationship, and maybe that short-term safety from the trauma, from the immediate trauma, but it's not long-term safety because we need to live in groups. So, and if you're not dealing with that, then it's a problem.
I think that group, and at least the way I've created it, and the way I support it is people have to be on a path of self-responsibility. First of all, they have to kind of learn about their own coping mechanisms, and then learn to overcome them towards a more secure nervous system, which includes self-care and self and other care, because it ends up being a kind of a social interaction, at least some of the time, and also regulation. So again, self-regulation, co-regulation, and sometimes auto-regulation, which means you have to do it by yourself. But it's the overcoming of the coping mechanisms that are constantly about survival into something that's more collaborative, ultimately.
So I think one of the things, that's happening right now is there's a lot of stuff happening in my world, and Mark is helping me untangle where my, what my values are and where my values lack boundaries. Not, it's not just where do I lack boundaries, but where have I not put bounds around the things that I value? Because like one of the pieces that I have is a tendency to value compassion above everything else, to the point of I don't put boundaries around what that means.
Yeah, and you're agreeable.
Yes, and I'm highly agreeable, and so there's those things create a situation where I am not able to effectively advocate for myself, and so then I recently got myself into a situation which I was not able to advocate for myself. And so like I had to, and then I had to remove myself, and like, but figuring out where, I think it would be an interesting thing to introduce the concept of virtues into the attachment conversation, because, instead of like, for me, learning, okay, I want to tap into the virtue of courage versus, it's like, I want to feel safe. Well, I desire to feel safe. Well, okay, but maybe what I need to tap into right now is the courage to feel the fear and do something anyway. And so how do you, and so like that, it seems like there's an important component to that. And it seems like that I'm starting to come to the conclusion or come to a realization that this may not be entirely the case, but sometimes what we see as attachment wounding is actually that interaction of where those boundaries are rubbing up against each other, and an inability to navigate that moral edge.
Yeah. Can you give an example? Like, I think you gave one in terms of not being able to advocate for yourself.
Right. Yeah. So an example being that, we're recently doing stuff with polyamory, and and there was a situation where, I couldn't add, like something was happening, and I realized that it wasn't that it didn't work for me. And I was trying to articulate that there was a problem, and I couldn't articulate that, okay, there's this line that I feel like that I've crossed, that I don't know how to articulate that it's been crossed.
Okay. So what would have been, what turned out, or what will be, or what would have been the right way to articulate it in this context?
In this context, and that's what I'm still trying, that's what I'm still working on, is figuring out, it's like, okay, so right now I am being able to say, I am struggling to be able to put the compassion I want to have for you aside, and and advocate for myself. It's like I feel like I'm really strongly, I want to have compassion for where you're at, and at the same time, by having compassion for you, I am violating my own boundaries. And so how, and so being able to articulate that, and that doesn't, but articulate that in such a way as to not make the other person wrong for what they're doing, so that we can navigate that line.
I have a question. So for me, when you say having compassion, it's just kind of feeling for the other person, or feeling what they're feeling, or some version of like understanding their pain, or feeling their pain, or feeling their pain with them, right? And that, for me, that doesn't necessarily mean that if I have compassion, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to change what I'm doing.
Right,
so
right. But that's where the boundaries come in. Like, you have to know that, and then look, you can't be responsible if you don't understand what your responsibilities could be, and what and understand your decisions around them. So one thing, for example, like if you have a couple and the woman decides she wants to stay home, say with the child, like that, there's a bunch of decisions there that got made, right? And maybe they got made without an understanding. And then if the other partner doesn't understand that and doesn't value, oh, well, you're just home with kids all day, right? Now you've got a mismatch, right? But you can't tell somebody in that situation, no, you just need to take responsibility. Take responsibility for what? Like, they don't necessarily know. And this goes back to, can you be ethical if you don't understand your ethics, if you don't understand what virtues you're holding up to change and manipulate the value system? Because then you can't negotiate, because you don't have boundaries. So you need all that stuff in order to be responsible for your actions and decisions and all of that. And so I think that's more what Kira in particular is pointing towards, is that, if you can't be responsible for things you don't understand. So you have to have that understanding, and that understanding actually requires you to have this relationship with these values, right? And set these boundaries ahead of time. And then when you're in a relationship, once you've set the boundaries for yourself, they have to move and change based on the other person. And if you don't go through that process, and then it doesn't matter how many, I mean, maybe you'll get lucky and you'll just, my boundaries and their boundaries will work, or they'll capitulate to me.
But it changes all the time. So
well, it could change. It could change. But even if it doesn't, like, how many people are going to get lucky? Is it going to be 1%? Probably not. Right. So most people are just going to end up in these serial relationships where they keep bouncing up against the same problems, because they don't even know how to be responsible for themselves.
So what you're speaking of, to me, what I call that sort of having a relationship to those values and sort of doing it responsibly, that's what I call sovereignty. It's like making better choices for yourself and for others in the relationship that you have with them, which includes essentially your moral framework, engaging and dancing and moving together with their moral framework, and the adjustments that need to be made as you move.
Or hopefully the ethical landscape's the same, or at least you're seeing it the same way. And then because I think that there are points where, there's no negotiation possible, right? Like, certainly. And I mean, you can do cool fake examples, like, alcoholics who are reformed can't be with alcoholic. That's just never going to work, right? So, and I know that's a contrived example, but it's a real example. It's something that absolutely does happen. It happens with drugs. It happens with polyamorous people can't be with people who want strict monogamous. Like there are hard limits, right? But that whole ethos around having a similar ethical outlook, I think that's really, really important. And then the way that interacts is that you still have to have values and boundaries, and they have to be renegotiated. Sovereignty is not something you're born with, and that you understand.
It's a skill.
So,
it's a skill.
Right. You have to develop that skill. And then what's the development of that skill to get you into the point where the maps for attachment actually work for you?
Right. Well, to me, the way I've sort of codified it is through what I call the journey to secure. The stages of the journey to secure were with sort of like the stages of development from unconscious, unskilled, unconscious to consciously unskilled to consciously skilled to unconsciously skilled. Some kind of general sense of you need to develop awareness in order to develop skill around how you engage with others. And if you're always in your coping mechanisms, you don't even realize you are. It's never gonna go over well, because it's either gonna be you're lucky or you're not lucky. But you're at the mercy of what's happening below the consciousness level.
Right. So I actually looked at that. It was an interesting way to frame things. So the problem then is there's no definition of security there. And if people are just fleeing to security, there's lots of ways to do it. And
it's not the group for them. That's what I've been telling people. If you're coming here and security or safety is your top value, this is not the group for you.
But it is in your chart. So that's the problem, is that they're seeing that, and it's very prominent because it's at every stage, right?
Insecure. The whole concept. Yeah. It's not about, right. Oh, I see what you mean. Right. So moving towards a more secure nervous system doesn't mean that security is a thing. It's a relative perspective. Again, it's like it's secure. You're reliably developing the kind of skills that lead you to feeling more secure, more reliably. That's essentially it. But if you need that when you join the group, then that's not it, because it's a terrain. You join the group, and the group is a terrain where you encounter different people and different things, and in so doing, you develop it's like play. It's like the smaller rats playing with the bigger rats. It's the place where you basically do your experiment, you be in conversations, and you learn to be more aware, and you enter into practices of engaging with others, but from the perspective of your coping mechanisms will come up, and then you have to overcome them.
But I think the conversations I saw were all around, hey, I'm at this point in my flight to security. It's like, well, what? That doesn't make any sense, right? And then other people are engaging, and that means they're validating and encouraging that work. And it's like, but they need to already be there, right? Is what you're saying, and fair enough. I agree.
No. If they're below the level of consciousness that they have coping mechanisms, this group's not going to be for them. The group is for stage 2 moving on, and if they have zero awareness, I think the group is going to be difficult. Or if they're moved by too much coping or too much insecurity that they're not aware of yet, I think the group is going to be difficult for them. But it's all about the amount of stretch people are able to withstand. And that was the whole conversation around trigger warnings and content warnings.
But it could be around awareness, right? That's my point, is that if people aren't aware of all their coping mechanisms, people aren't aware of their ethos that they're operating on, right? But then how do you determine that?
Or lack thereof.
One of a way to filter people out of the group who don't belong there.
I mean, we do the best we can via letting people know what the group's about, including the virtues to work towards. And if they're like, what the fuck is that about? Or, I need more than what is given to me, then, regularly we let people in the group know that they have to live up to the agreements of the group, which do require them to work towards self-responsibility and be kind to each other, and a few other rules, which I'd rather call agreements, but rules of the group. If they feel like it's going to be too difficult for them, and sometimes it happens. Some people are on the group and they're like, I don't understand what's going on with this group, and why are you guys doing it this way? And I'm like, look at the rule, look at the rules and the agreements. Like if that doesn't jive with you in some ways, or it doesn't feel safe to you, then this is not the place for you. There are groups that are safer, that are for people who have PTSD or CPTSD or who have psychosis, and this is not the group for you. I mean, sometimes we have to literally tell specific people this, you might want to self-select out of this one. We love you, we'd love to have you, but if it feels too intense for you, that's not it. This is not it. And even the ability to discover, or at least to receive somebody else's feedback that this may not be the group for them, that's a piece of awareness they might not have. And then they're like, well, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm like, well, if you're having a hard time and it's consistent, like you were talking about consistency, right? Or reliability. If you're reliably having a hard time in this group and you don't really enjoy it and you don't feel like you're getting ahead of the game, it's like going on a playground where all the boys are 15 and you're 10 and you're trying to play rough with them and get your ass kicked.
No, I agree. Like I said, I mean, I saw a number of conversations where I was like, look at these people in their journey to security, and they the advice seemed to be more on the just get the hell out of the relationship and get safe. It's like, what?
Well, I mean, if you're constantly in overdrive or in overwhelm or in some level of a trauma state, I mean, it's if out of your 100% time awake time, you only have 5% of it that you can think straight, it's going to be difficult to move forward.
Oh yeah, no, of course, but I think I think so. Part of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lecture series from John Vervaeke, right? So he's basically stating that the big problem is people don't know enough about themselves and about what they want and where they are to make these difficult sort of decisions around and engaging with meaning. And I would say that's tied up in all this. If you don't understand the meaning and value of the relationship you're in, then you're going to have a hard time negotiating that relationship. But I think that's the default state for almost everybody. And that's really the difference, is that they're never going to get to that point of sovereignty. I mean, most people, you question one of their ideas and it just falls apart and they get angry. Like, well, now I can't have a conversation with you anymore.
I agree. And it's the difficulty of, I don't know what to call it, sort of up-leveling anyone who is in a state that I would say like deep stage 1 or stage 0, where they're unaware, they have zero skills. If having an ethical system that works, that exists, that's mature, if that's non-existent, then like they're zero skills, and shit is just happening to them, and then they're unaware of that, and so even if you tell them in their face, they're going to be like, you're full of shit, and it's like, what's the path of being at levels at stage 0 to anything more than that? Sometimes it takes like hitting rock bottom. It takes a particular experience. I mean, it's their hero's journey where you hit the abyss and you're like, oh shit, I do have resources. And then you kind of express them and then you start the trajectory. But how it seems like initially that the gravity of the self is very hard to break from. I mean, even like, Keegan would say that most people are at level 3, but very few people at level 4, even less level 5. So, and there's still a bunch of people stuck at level 2, which is the narcissistic phase. So to get free from that is really, really tough. And I don't think we can count on people to break free from that gravity.
Right. No, and there's a deep narcissism problem in our societies, right?
Well, like to what extent does trauma, does being in a traumatic situation, induce narcissistic thought processes? So,
I would say it increases it because it brings you closer to survival.
Right. Yeah.
Put you more in survival mode. Yeah,
if you're in a trauma state, you're in survival mode. So in survival mode, it's like, it's me versus the world. I just need to survive.
Right, and that's the tribalism right there.
At a larger scale,
And to what extent, and knowing the level of your capability to engage with someone who is in trauma, and if you don't have the level of skill to engage with someone that's in trauma, you might accidentally induce trauma within yourself. That's sort of this,
or more with them.
What was that?
Or more with them, because eventually you'll flip out because they're just throwing so much shit at you that eventually you'll be like, I can't deal with this shit anymore, and then more trauma.
Yeah.
And it might throw you into trauma even if you're pretty stable in the first place, and you sort of devolve for a time, even though inside of you there's the understanding of how far you've gotten, so that doesn't go away. You don't forget that, but it could take you down. It could cut you at the knee for a while until you manage to crawl your way back of the hole of what do you call it, narcissism or survival.
Yeah. Right.
the initial crawling out is, I think it requires a huge amount of work and a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of energy. And then when you're out, at least you know what's possible.
Right.
Or sometimes you see it in others. That's what I think, that's where inspiration comes from. You get inspired by where
Right.
somebody has gone, and you know it's possible, at least with them. So maybe it's possible for you. But until you experience it in your body, in your nervous system, and where you kind of relax at that level of grounding or goodness or quiet goodness, like,
Yeah.
and I think there's philosophies that are relate to that. That's sort of like quiet abiding. To me, that's
Right.
sort of like, that's what it's pointing to. It's pointing to essentially deep inner security.
Yeah.
But until you've touched it and felt it and know it, it's damn near impossible to get to, and
Yeah.
most people don't.
Yeah, well, that's a very religious framework, by the way. But yeah, I agree. Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm talking about like the emotional labor that a person has to do to go from deep trauma all the way to deep to deep quiet goodness, secure feeling of security, right. that doesn't just get ripped away, you know, when there's a sound coming through or when somebody taps you on the shoulder.
You're in the religio, as John would call it at that point. You're way out.
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty far out. But even to be able to conjure it when it's needed, like, okay,
right.
your shit happens, somebody cuts you off on the highway, and you need to get back to, okay, I've got this, I can breathe, I can think straight, I'm not in trauma state anymore. Even that, for the first time, for a lot of people, that's damn well near impossible.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, they're in reactive mode. They don't have a sense of their own sovereignty and person in relation to others, right? And therefore, the world is basically me versus everyone else, and that's
is that the red meme in the Spiral Dynamics?
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, there's a bunch of other ones, but, you know, it's being in survival mode at that level. It takes a lot of energy to escape that, to escape the gravity of that. But I think it's doable, and I think, you know, the goal of the group, to go back to the group, is for people to at least gain enough awareness that they can start to catch themselves, because they'll recognize the pattern of what's been happening, or they'll see the pattern in somebody else. They'll say, oh, I've seen that pattern too. Oh, I've done that pattern. Oh, it's normal. Oh, okay. Now I can catch myself. And maybe initially you catch yourself 3 weeks later, and then you catch yourself 3 days later, and you catch yourself 3 hours, and eventually you catch yourself in the moment, and then eventually you can kind of foresee it. Yeah. And that kind of foresight is that's where the gold is. That's level 4 in the stages of, you know, the journey to secure, as I've defined it. Right. You know, you have foresight around how bad things can get, and you can actually brace yourself or orient differently, not just in the moment, but ahead of time.
Yeah. Orientation is a big theme on my channel. So orientation is very important.
I'm looking forward to listening to you, because this has been really great, and unfortunately I have to go. Yeah. But this has been fantastic. I had no idea when Kara mentioned it. Like, the first time we had to cancel because I had a shitty day as all hell. I think that's what it was, and I was like, no way in hell I can have a remotely intellectual conversation, because I was very much in some kind of trauma state, having done a lot of fighting, and I can't remember, but it was not pretty. So thank you for your patience in rescheduling this, and thanks, Kira, for supporting it happening again, for your pleasure.
No, it seemed like it was an important conversation. To me, it seemed like an important conversation to have, just because in terms of the level of both of you guys, it seemed like it was going to be something that could that would be fruitful.
Nice. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I appreciate intellectual conversations, period. For me, it's like, I don't care if we agree or disagree. Like, I'm gonna learn something, and I'm gonna walk out. I'm gonna walk away a little smarter, because I will have interacted with somebody else with a different brain. So
I agree. It's a pleasure meeting you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise.
Bye, Philippe.
Cool.
Thank you.
I don't know what we want to do with the conversation, but you know, I'm open for it to be public in some version, because I think there's some really good tidbits in there.
Yeah. We could always add it to your channel.
Yeah, if you want.
Yeah, maybe we could do that. I'll give it some thought. We'll see what we want to do. Thank you so much for watching this hour plus talk. I hope you found something useful here. Let me know what you think, and as always, thank you for your time and attention to this material.